The wind was a sculptor, and the land was its clay. It carved the plains into long, mournful sighs and polished the stones until they shone like bone. Elias knew the language of this wind. It spoke of absence. It whispered through the dry grass around the two small mounds on the hill behind his homestead, a constant, chilling reminder of the silence that now owned his house. He rode the fence line not because the fence needed mending, but because the routine was the only thing holding the pieces of him together. Each post was a day he had survived. Each stretch of wire, a night he had endured. His horse, Apollo, moved with a familiarity born of 1,000 such journeys, his hooves kicking up clouds of dust that hung in the air like ghosts. Elias's gaze was fixed on the horizon, a place where the pale, unforgiving sky met the bruised earth. It was a sterile kind of beauty, one that matched the hollowed-out landscape of his own heart. The world had shrunk to this ranch, to this fence, to the memory of a woman's laugh and a small boy's hand in his. He saw them everywhere. Sarah, hanging laundry on a line that now sagged, empty. Daniel, chasing a grasshopper near the barn, his face alight with a joy that felt like a relic from another lifetime. These visions were no longer painful stabs of grief, they were dull, persistent aches, the phantom limbs of a life amputated. It was near the dried-out artery of what was once Willow Creek that he saw it. A flicker of movement that didn't belong to the wind or the wildlife. It was furtive, desperate. He pulled Apollo to a halt, his hand resting on the worn leather of his saddle horn. His eyes, accustomed to spotting a stray calf from a mile away, narrowed. He dismounted, his boots making no sound on the parched ground. He moved with the quiet deliberation of a man who preferred to observe rather than be observed. As he crested a small rise, the scene unfolded below him, a tableau of profound misery. 3 girls. They couldn't have been more than 12, 8, and 5. Their clothes were rags, their hair was matted with grime and twigs, and their faces were smudged with dirt, accentuating the skeletal thinness of their frames. They looked less like children and more like a pack of starving coyotes, their backs hunched as they clawed at the unyielding earth with sticks and their raw, bleeding fingers. They were digging for roots, for grubs, for anything the merciless land might offer up. The eldest, her face a mask of fierce, premature adulthood, worked with a grim determination. The middle child copied her older sister, her movement smaller, more hesitant. The youngest, barely a toddler, was clumsy, her small hand scrabbling uselessly at the dirt. Elias felt nothing at first. It was just a sight, another sad feature of a sad world. His capacity for emotion had been cauterized long ago. He was a spectator to his own life, why should this be any different? He watched as the smallest one, her strength finally giving out, slumped to the ground. She let out a soft whimper, a sound that was almost swallowed by the vast emptiness around them. She pushed herself up on trembling arms, her vision swimming with exhaustion and the blinding glare of the sun. Her gaze landed on Elias's tall, still figure, a dark silhouette against the stark sky. For a fleeting, delirious moment, his shape merged with a memory, a desperate hope. A tear cut a clean path through the dirt on her cheek. Pa! The word was a fragile wisp of sound, a prayer. Don't leave, again the sentence, small as it was, struck Elias with the force of a physical blow. It bypassed the scar tissue around his heart and hit something raw and buried. It was the voice of his own son, the echo of every fear he'd ever had. Before he could process it, the eldest girl was on her feet. She moved with the speed of a cornered animal, placing her thin body between him and the little one. She held a sharpened rock in her hand, her knuckles white. Her eyes, filled with a hatred and fear that no child should ever know, met his. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her entire being was a snarl, a promise of violence, a defiant declaration that she would die here before letting him touch them. Elias stood frozen, the child's plea echoing in the silent chamber of his soul. The wind whipped around them, carrying the scent of dust and despair. And in that moment, the fence he had been mending all this time, the one that kept the world out and his grief in, developed its first, tiny crack. Elias did not move forward. He did not speak. The language of predators and prey was one he understood, and the girl with the rock in her hand was fluent. Any sudden motion, any attempt at comfort, would be seen as aggression. He raised his hands slowly, palms open, a universal sign of peace that felt foreign and clumsy. He held the girl's furious gaze for a long moment, a silent acknowledgement of her courage. Then, with the same deliberate slowness, he began to back away. He unslung the canteen from his shoulder, its metal catching the glint of the sun. He set it on the ground, 20 feet from where they huddled. Beside it, he placed the small, all-paper-wrapped parcel of salted jerky and hardtack from his little bag. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. He retreated further, climbing back onto Apollo, never turning his back on them until he was a safe distance away. He rode home, the image of the three of them burned into his mind. The house felt different when he returned. The silence was no longer just the absence of his family, it was now filled with the presence of those girls. He walked through the rooms, touching the back of Sarah's rocking chair, tracing the outline of the small, carved horse on the mantelpiece, a gift for Daniel's 6th birthday, a birthday he never reached. That night, sleep did not come. The plea, "Don't leave, Pa," played on a loop, each repetition chipping away at the fortress of his apathy. The next day, he rode back to the creek bed. They were gone. But the canteen was empty, lying on its side, and the oil paper was torn open, the food consumed. A knot of something unfamiliar, relief, loosened in his chest. He left another canteen and a larger parcel of food in the same spot. He did this for 3 days. It became a new routine, a pilgrimage to a strange, invisible shrine of suffering. On the 4th day, he saw them again, watching him from a cluster of rocks higher up the creek bed. He pretended not to notice, set down his offerings, and rode away. He was teaching them, as one would teach a wild thing, that he was not a threat. He was a source of sustenance, a fixed point in their chaotic world. The sky began to change on the 5th day. The pale blue bruised to a deep, ominous gray. The wind shifted, carrying the damp smell of rain. By late afternoon, the heavens opened. It wasn't a gentle summer shower, it was a cold, driving deluge that turned the dust to mud and blurred the horizon into a watery smear. Elias stood on his porch, watching the downpour, and thought of them. They wouldn't survive this. Not in their rags, not with their meager strength. He saddled Apollo without a second thought, pulling on his heavy oilskin duster. He rode into the storm, the rain lashing at his face, his eyes scanning the landscape for any sign of shelter. He found them huddled beneath a shallow rock overhang, a place that offered little protection from the wind and the relentless water. They were soaked through, shivering violently, their bodies pressed together for warmth. The youngest, Lily, was coughing, a deep, ragged sound that spoke of lungs filling with fluid. Elias dismounted, his boot sinking into the sodden earth. He approached the overhang slowly. The eldest, Ilara, scrambled to her feet, her teeth chattering from cold and rage. "Get away from us," she screamed, her voice thin against the roar of the storm. Elias stopped. He looked past her, at the small, trembling form of Lily, whose coughs were growing weaker. He met Ilara's defiant eyes. His own voice was a low rumble, rough from years of disuse. "The little one needs a roof," he said, not as a command, but as an undeniable truth. A fire he waited. Ilara's fierce gaze flickered from his face to her sister's pale, shivering form. Every instinct told her to fight, to run, to trust no one. But the sound of Lily's labored breathing was a more powerful force than her fear. It was the sound of defeat. Her shoulders slumped. Elias turned and began walking back toward his horse, not looking to see if they followed. He simply trusted that they would. He heard the squelch of small feet in the mud behind him and led them home. The house was a shock to their systems. The warmth, the smell of wood smoke and old leather, the sheer quiet order of it. He led them into the main room and pointed to the fire roaring in the hearth. "Get warm." He disappeared into the kitchen and returned with 3 bowls of thick beef stew. He set them on the floor, a safe distance from the hearth, and then retreated to Daniel's old room. He returned with a stack of his son's old clothes, small shirts and trousers that would be too big but were clean and, most importantly, dry. He placed them on a chair and then walked out of the house, closing the door softly behind him. He stood on the covered porch, the rain drumming a steady rhythm on the roof, giving them the space they needed. For the first time in 2 years, the walls of his home held the sounds of life, faint and frightened though they might be. And Elias found that he was not afraid of them. The house became a crucible. Inside, for fractured souls began the slow, arduous process of annealing. The first few days were a study in silence and distance. The girls moved through the rooms like ghosts, flitting from his presence, their bare feet making no sound on the wooden floors. They ate the food he left for them on the kitchen table, their eyes darting towards him, constantly assessing the threat. They slept together in Daniel's room, barricading the door with a small chair, a flimsy defense that spoke volumes of their terror. Elias understood. He did not push. He simply existed alongside them, a quiet, constant presence. He mended his fences, chopped wood, tended to his meager livestock. His routine became their anchor. They learned the rhythm of his days, the pre-dawn coffee, the long hours outdoors, the quiet evenings by the fire. He was predictable. In their world, predictability was safety. Ilara remained the sentinel. She watched him with an unnerving intensity, her young face set in a permanent scowl of suspicion. She was a she-wolf guarding her cubs, and he was the unknown male, circling the den. He found her one afternoon watching him as he clumsily tried to patch a tear in one of Lily's ragged dresses with a thick needle meant for stitching leather. He wasn't a seamster, his work was crude, functional. He didn't look up, but he spoke into the quiet room. "Your sister will need proper clothes. If you're to stay for the winter." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, an assumption of a future they hadn't dared to imagine. He saw her flinch, as if the idea of the winter was a luxury they couldn't afford. The middle child, Sarah, was the observer. She was a shadow, absorbing everything. He'd catch glimpses of her watching his hands as he worked, her expression a mixture of fear and fascination. One morning, he found her in the yard, meticulously arranging pebbles into patterns in the dirt. He went into the house and returned with a small stack of paper yellowed with age and a stick of charcoal from the hearth. He set them down near her, much as he had left the canteen, and walked away. The next day, the pebbles were gone, and the paper was filled with surprisingly detailed drawings of the barn, of Apollo, of a bird on the fence post. Lily was the first to thaw. The trauma she'd endured was a sharp, fresh wound, but her innocence hadn't been entirely extinguished. It was in the way her eyes widened at the taste of jam on a piece of bread, or the way she'd traced the patterns on Sarah's old quilt. Elias found Daniel's small, hand-carved bird, its paint faded and worn. He left it on the edge of the hearth one evening. He watched from the corner of his eye as Lily crept forward, her tiny hand hovering over the object before finally snatching it and retreating back to the safety of her sisters. Later, he saw her asleep, her small fist still clutching the wooden bird as if it were a holy relic. A fragile bridge had been crossed. Weeks bled into a month. The girls' ribs became less prominent. The haunted, feral look in their eyes began to recede, replaced by a cautious curiosity. Color returned to their cheeks. He took them into town, a nerve-wracking journey for all of them. He bought them new clothes, sturdy boots, and ribbons for their hair. The shopkeeper's wife looked at the strange quartet, the grim, silent man and the three skittish girls who clung to each other, with open curiosity, but said nothing. The change was most apparent in Ilara. One day, he was restringing a section of fence that had snapped in the storm. She approached him, her arms crossed, her chin jutting out. "Show me," she demanded. He handed her the pliers and a staple. He guided her hands, his large, calloused fingers over her small, surprisingly strong ones. She learned quickly, her movements precise and efficient. As they worked side by side in the warm afternoon sun, she finally asked the question that had been shadowing them for weeks. "Why?" Her voice was low, almost accusatory. "Why are you doing this?" Elias stopped his work. He didn't look at her, but stared out at the two grave markers on the hill. His voice was gravelly, thick with unspoken grief. "Had a boy," he said. Name was Daniel. He paused, the silence stretching between them. He'd have been about your sister's age. He swallowed hard. A man ought to do something. Other than just rust. He had shared a piece of his brokenness, and in doing so, had given her a piece of himself she could understand. Her defiance softened, replaced by a flicker of empathy. The house was no longer just his shrine of grief. It was becoming their sanctuary. The silence was now punctuated by Sarah's quiet humming or Lily's occasional, tentative laughter. The ghosts of Sarah and Daniel were still there, but they were no longer accusatory. They felt peaceful. But miles away, in the dusty, indifferent town, a new threat was taking root. A man, well-dressed and carrying an air of greasy authority, had dismounted in front of the sheriff's office. He unrolled a notice, its edges frayed from travel. It offered a reward for information leading to the return of 3 girls, his wards, who had tragically run away. Sheriff Fuller, a man for whom the law was a set of instructions devoid of morality, took the notice. He read the names, Ilara, Sarah, and Lily, and hammered it onto the public board, right next to a poster for a county fair. The paper fluttered in the breeze, an unseen, unheard promise of devastation. The piece arrived like a high-plains summer, hot, bright, and achingly beautiful, but with the constant, underlying threat of a sudden storm. The girls had begun to inhabit the space around Elias, no longer just existing in the corners of his life. Sarah's charcoal drawings papered the wall of their room, a gallery of their new world. Lily, a small, constant shadow at Elias's heels, would bring him offerings, a smooth stone, a fallen feather, the wooden bird, her face serious with the importance of the gift. Even Ilara had lowered her guard. She worked alongside him now, her presence a comfortable silence rather than a tense standoff. She learned to read the sky, to anticipate the needs of the animals, her resilience hardening into a formidable competence. One evening, as a golden dusk settled over the ranch, Elias sat on the porch steps, cleaning a rifle, the scent of gun oil sharp in the cooling air. Lily was sitting beside him, carefully trying to braid a doll's hair out of stray pieces of twine. Out of the quiet, she asked a question. "Are you our pa now?" The words were simple, innocent, yet they landed with the weight of a sacrament. Elias stopped his work. He looked down at her small, upturned face, her eyes wide with genuine curiosity. He thought of the man she had mistaken him for, the man who had abandoned them to the dirt. He thought of his own son, buried on the hill. His throat was tight. "I reckon I am," he said, his voice softer than he intended. A smile, the first true, unguarded smile he had seen from her, blossomed on her face. It was in this moment of fragile, sacred peace that the storm finally broke. 2 riders appeared on the horizon, their forms shimmering in the late-day heat. They were not wandering cowboys or lost travelers. They rode with purpose, heading directly for the homestead. Elias's hand tightened on the rifle. A cold dread, an instinct he hadn't felt in years, coiled in his gut. Ilara, who had been coming from the barn, froze, her body going rigid. She had seen that posture before. She recognized the arrogance in the lead rider's silhouette. As they drew closer, the figures resolved into 2 men. One was Sheriff Fuller, his badge glinting dully on his vest, his face set in a mask of bureaucratic impassivity. The other rider. Elias didn't know him, but the girls did. A wave of terror washed over them, so potent it was almost visible. Lily dropped her twine doll and scrambled behind Elias's legs, her small body trembling. Sarah, who had been by the water pump, backed away slowly, her eyes wide with horror. Ilara stood her ground, but the color had drained from her face, leaving behind the pale, haunted mask of the girl he had first found by the creek. The lead rider was a man in his late 40s, dressed in clothes that were too fine for the dusty plains. He had a handsome face that was spoiled by a smug, cruel twist to his lips. He dismounted with a fluid motion, his polished boot sinking into the dirt he clearly disdained. He surveyed the homestead, the house, the girls, and finally Elias, his gaze lingering with possessive insolence. "Well, well," the man said, his voice a smooth, oily caress that slid over the skin like something unclean. "Look what the wind blew in. I've been looking all over for you girls," he smiled, but it didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "It's time to come home." Sheriff Fuller dismounted more slowly, his expression one of weary resignation. He avoided Elias's gaze. "Elias," he began, his tone flat. "This is Mr. Silas Blackwood. He's the girl's legal stepfather and guardian." Blackwood stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Elara. "I'll thank you for watching over my property," he said to Elias, the word property dripping with condescension. "But their holiday is over." Elias rose slowly to his full height, the rifle held loosely but purposefully in his hand. He placed himself squarely between Blackwood and the children. His voice was low, a dangerous rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. "They ain't property." The Blackwood smirk widened. He produced a folded sheaf of papers from his coat pocket and presented them to the sheriff. "Guardianship papers. Signed and sealed by a circuit judge. They belong to me, by law." Fuller glanced at the papers and nodded curtly. "The law is the law, Elias. He has the claim, the systemic antagonist, indifferent and absolute." Blackwood took a step toward Elara, his hand outstretched. "Come on, girl. Stop this foolishness. You've caused enough troubles." Elara flinched back as if he were a hot iron, a primal, reflexive terror that was more damning than any testimony. "Don't you touch me," she whispered, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and newfound defiance. The man's face darkened for a split second before the smug mask returned. He looked at the sheriff. "See what I have to deal with? They're wild. This man has filled their heads with nonsense." He turned back to Elias. "I'm taking them. You have no say in the matter." The standoff was absolute. The setting sun cast long, dramatic shadows across the yard, turning the scene into a stark frieze of conflict. On one side stood the law, cold and unyielding, embodied by a cruel man and an indifferent sheriff. On the other stood a broken man who had just found a reason to be whole, shielding 3 terrified children with nothing but his own conviction. The fragile world they had built was about to be torn to shreds. The air grew thick, heavy with the unspoken violence of the moment. Sheriff Fuller shifted his weight, his hand moving to rest on the butt of his pistol. It wasn't a threat, not yet, but a clear signal. He was an agent of the paper in his hand, not of the justice in the air. "Elias," Fuller said, his voice strained with impatience. "Don't make this hard. Let the man take his children." But Elias didn't look at the sheriff. He looked at Silas Blackwood, at the smug certainty on that man's face, the look of a vulture who knows the meal is his for the taking. He saw the way Blackwood's eyes roamed over Elara, not with the concern of a father, but with the cold calculation of a merchant assessing his goods. He knew he could not win a fight against the law. He could kill Blackwood where he stood, but the sheriff would kill him, and the girls would be cast adrift once more, this time with the added trauma of witnessing his death. There was only one weapon he had left. The truth. He lowered his gaze to Elara, who stood frozen, a statue of terror. He spoke to her, his voice low and steady, a lifeline in a maelstrom of fear. "Elara, tell me why you ran." It was a simple question, but it held the power to shatter everything. Blackwood scoffed. "Don't bother listening to her lies. She's a fanciful girl, always has been." But Elias's eyes never left Elara. "Tell me," he repeated, his voice imbued with a quiet authority she had come to trust. Something inside her broke free. It was the weeks of safety, the feel of clean clothes, the taste of regular meals, the quiet dignity Elias had afforded her. It was the memory of his hand showing her how to mend a fence, the sound of his voice speaking of his own lost son. She had been seen not as property, but as a person. That knowledge was her shield now. She lifted her chin, and for the first time, she looked directly at Silas Blackwood, her eyes burning with a righteous fire that eclipsed her fear. She spoke, her voice clear and strong, resonating across the silent yard. "We ran because he starved us," she began, each word a hammer blow against Blackwood's composure. "He'd lock us in the cellar for days with nothing but a little water. He called it teaching us our place." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. Blackwood's face was beginning to pale beneath his confident veneer. "Lies. All of it." Elara ignored him, her gaze now turning to Sheriff Fuller, forcing him to be a witness. He sold Sarah's locket, the only thing she had of our mother. Said a pretty thing was wasted on a plain girl. He took the money and spent it on cards. Sarah began to weep silently, her small shoulders shaking. Ilara's voice grew harder, colder. And then he told me. He told me I was old enough now. That I had to start earning my keep. She paused, the words catching in her throat, but she forced them out, raw and horrifying. He made a deal with a man from a mining camp. He was going to sell me to him. He said a girl's back was her only true currency. The ugly truth hung in the air, sickening and undeniable. The smugness on Blackwood's face finally cracked, shattering into a mask of pure fury. "You ungrateful little whelp," he roared, his civility vanishing completely. "I'll teach you to spread such filth." He lunged. Not at Elias, but at Ilara. His intention was clear, to silence her, to punish her, to break her back into submission. But he never reached her. Elias moved with a speed that was terrifying in its economy. There was no rage in his expression, only a chilling, absolute certainty. He dropped the rifle and stepped into Blackwood's path. It was not a fight. It was a conclusion. One of Elias's hands shot out, grabbing the front of Blackwood's fine coat, twisting it. The other hand, a fist as hard and unforgiving as granite, struck Blackwood once in the jaw. The sound was a sickening crack, followed by a grunt of pain as the man crumpled, his momentum carrying him into a heap at Elias's feet. He lay on the ground, spitting blood and a tooth into the dust, his arrogance extinguished. Silence descended, broken only by Blackwood's pathetic moans. Sheriff Fuller stood frozen, his hand still on his gun. He had witnessed it all, the girl's gut-wrenching testimony, the man's self-incriminating rage, and the swift, decisive justice delivered by the homesteader. He looked from the whimpering man on the ground to Elias, who now stood over the girls like a mountain range, unmovable and absolute. Fuller was a man of the law, but the law had just been revealed as an ass. He made a choice. He slowly took his hand off his gun. He looked down at the pathetic form of Silas Blackwood. "Looks to me," the sheriff said, his voice dry as dust, "like Mr. Blackwood here took a nasty fall. Tripped on his own feet." He then lifted his gaze to meet Elias's. There was a new, grudging respect in his eyes. "And it looks to me like these children have found a good home." He turned without another word, mounted his horse, and tipped his hat slightly. "I won't be back to question it, Elias." He rode away, leaving the wreckage of the law behind him. The threat, both human and systemic, was gone. Elias's shoulders, which had been rigid with tension, finally slumped. He knelt, his knees cracking, until he was at eye level with the girls. He looked at each of them, at the tear tracks on their faces, at the lingering fear in their eyes, but also at the new strength that was dawning there. They were not strays he had rescued. They were his. Ilara stared at him, her chest heaving. No words were needed. Her look was one of profound, soul-deep gratitude. Sarah wiped her eyes and took a hesitant step forward. And then Lily, the little one who had started it all with a single, mistaken word, moved. She stepped past her sister, past the memory of the monster in the dirt, and walked right up to Elias. She reached out and, for the first time, willingly placed her small, trembling hand into his large, calloused one. The contact was an anchor, a promise, a final, binding stitch on a newly mended family. He squeezed her hand gently, and for the first time since he had laid his own son in the ground, Elias felt the warm bloom of hope in his chest. Later, the four of them stood on the porch, watching the last sliver of the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and deep purple. The vast, empty land no longer looked desolate. It looked like a promise. The camera of the mind would pull back, showing the small, solid house, the neatly mended fences, the two old graves on the hill and the one new, unmarked one far from the house. And on the porch, four figures stand together, a constellation of survivors, watching the stars begin to prick the darkening sky. A found family, forged in the crucible of grief and redeemed by the fierce, unwavering power of a love they had chosen for themselves.